Before we start the podcast, we wanted to let you know about WestOS. If you're a teacher or pupil at a school in Scotland, then you now have access to hundreds of quality-assured video lessons created by teachers to support your remote learning. You should be able to find WestOS within the app library of Glow, where you can add the tile to your own personal launchpad. Click on the tile and you'll have immediate access to stream lessons in every area of the Scottish curriculum, with video lessons already available for biology at National 5, Higher and Advanced Higher. Now let's get on with the podcast. This podcast is sponsored by Lecky Textbooks, Revision Guides and Practice Papers. Everything you need to learn, review and prepare for your senior phase assessments. Browse the books at www.leckyscotland.co.uk and get 40% off using the discount code LECKYPODCAST40. You can now also collect Young Scot reward points by using the codes within the description of each episode to claim discounts and rewards on their website, www.young.scot.
There has been some scientific research done on the actual noses of reindeer.
As schools across the country finish for the Christmas holiday, we'll be getting festive, learning about the North Pole, reindeer and Christmas trees. I'll be joined by fellow Glasgow science teacher Mr. Quant, as he explains how he has ended up battling it out for Christmas #1 in the UK charts. We will learn about the Christmas tree industry in Scotland and how one woman fell in love in the Cairngorms, got married and has been raising reindeer ever since. Throughout the episode, we will go on an Arctic adventure while considering the impact of climate change on some of our planet's coldest environments, as we take a break from the course content and step into this Christmas holiday special. Ask any child where Santa lives and they will more than likely tell you the North Pole. In fact, just this week, Dr. Anthony Fauci, Director of National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease in America, told children at a White House press conference that he had vaccinated Santa Claus against coronavirus at the North Pole. So it seems like a good time to welcome back friend of the podcast and David Attenborough's principal cameraman, Doug Allan.
Hello there. Hello, Paul.
So,
good
Doug,
to talk to you.
good to talk to you again too. Doug, you've spent a lot of time in the Arctic. Have you made it to the North Pole?
I have made it to the North Pole. I've made it to the North Pole twice, actually. Once on an icebreaker, a big nuclear icebreaker. And the second time, well, we kind of passed underneath it because I was actually in a submarine at the time. I was in a submarine going from Glasgow to Alaska. And the submarine was a scientific expedition, well, with the Royal Navy. And as the submarine went underneath the ice, it was measuring the thickness of the ice and what they call pressure ridges, which is where the ice is pushed down when flows come together. And this sort of work had been going on for the last 40 years or so. And it's work like that that's given us this long-term, this long data range, this long-term information about the ice. You've got to remember that the North Pole, when you stand at the North Pole, you're not standing on top of any land. You're actually standing on top of a frozen ocean. It's very different from the Antarctic, which is a frozen continent. But the North Pole is frozen ice. So I have been there. When we went there on the top, I think we didn't see any animals actually at the North Pole itself. But on the way, we passed a few polar bears, a few seals popping their heads up, stuff like that. But I've got to say, there's not much. When you stand on top of the ice at the North Pole, there's not much difference between being there or anywhere else on the frozen ice of the Arctic. In fact, you'll probably see less at the North Pole than you would do in other places.
So no candy canes?
No, I'm afraid not. I did keep my eye open for Santa but it was kind of the summer when I went there. So Santa was probably on his holidays somewhere else.
As you said, it is the most northernmost point of the Earth. I guess you must have some pretty extreme weather up there, even in the summer.
And what's interesting, actually, you don't. I mean, in the summer at the North Pole, the average temperatures probably hover around zero. or so. In the winter, it gets much colder. In the winter, it gets down to minus 35, 40 sometimes. Having said that, a few years ago, there was a remarkable heat wave hit the Arctic round about Christmas, and the remote satellite sensors were picking up temperatures at the North Pole of about plus 10 degrees centigrade, which is ridiculous for the sort of end of December at the North Pole. But it's typical of how the temperatures there are swinging between the extremes just as much as anywhere else. In fact, maybe even more than anywhere else. But I would say in a normal summer, you go to the North Pole at midsummer, that's say the middle of June into July when it's warmest, then you're looking at temperatures between about -5 and +5, something like that. Of course, you've got 24-hour daylight up there all the time in the summer, so it doesn't really get a chance to get too cold. In the winter, on the other hand, it's 24 hours of darkness, so the temperature does really go down and it starts to bite.
I guess even within the summer, it must still be a pretty tough place to work. What is it like to spend significant time in those conditions, and have there been times that you were worried you might not make it out?
No, the time I went on the surface to the North Pole, I went in a nuclear icebreaker, a Russian nuclear icebreaker. And this thing, we were hitting ice on the way to the North Pole. We were going through ice that was maybe 3 meters thick. And this thing just chopped through it like a knife through butter. It could keep up 7 or 8 knots of speed right through that ice. It was no problem at all breaking it. Sometimes the wind will shuffle the ice around across the Arctic Ocean and can pile it up and make it thicker and heavier to break through. So in terms of a North Pole trip, I never really had much doubt that we would get out there, get there and get back okay. But there have been occasions working around about the edge, around about the periphery of the Arctic Ocean, working on the sea ice there, where it's been a bit hairier, where I have had the sea ice break up round about where I was working. And there was one occasion when I had to get rescued, or 2 occasions when I had to get rescued by a helicopter, and 1 occasion when I had to get rescued by a twin otter when the sea ice broke up in the summer, but it broke up when we were working on the ice. So it is, the ice is a continually changing environment. You can think about the Arctic Ocean not as one big solid piece of ice, but think about it as pieces of an ice jigsaw, and the currents and the wind shift these pieces around and juggle them around and sometimes smash them together and sometimes open them wide apart. And there's no doubt that getting to the North Pole on foot, I think, is a far harder challenge than getting to the South Pole. At least at the South, when you're walking to the South Pole, you go to sleep and you wake up in the same place because you're basically walking across a frozen continent. When you walk to the North Pole, as soon as you get onto that sea ice, even while you sleep, that sea ice will be moving and shuffling around. So it's a big problem. You can be on your way to the North Pole and cracks will open in front of the ice and you're getting moved off your goal and all the rest of it. So, the North Pole is very different working from the north and the south. On the other hand, you get polar bears in the north and penguins in the south, as I'm sure all our listeners must know by now.
And actually, the idea of who reached the North Pole, first of all, is quite a controversial subject. You mentioned, obviously, the challenges of getting there on foot. My understanding from doing a wee bit of research is it's a gentleman called Sir Wally Herbert, who's actually from the UK, who's credited now with being the first person to reach the North Pole on foot back in 1969. And Borg Usland and Erling Kag both reached it on skis without a resupply. In a journey that took 58 days. I guess, Herbert and Usland, their journey's not quite as luxurious as yourself in the big icebreaker.
No, I mean, those guys, what happened, the first person, or 2 people, claimed to have got to the North Pole in about 1908. One was a guy called Frederick Cook, and the other one was a guy called Peary. And Peary was a great Arctic explorer. He was an American. Cook, he was a bit less dependable, let's say, but both of them were big heroes. Both of them claimed to have reached the North Pole. Cook, slightly before, the year before, Peary claimed. Now, as it's worked out, I think both of their claims have become extremely dubious. Cook's was almost disowned at the time because he couldn't really prove it. Peary's stood the test of time for much longer, partly because Peary was an admiral in the American Navy. He was supported by National Geographic magazine. There was a lot of kind of friends in high places that he had that didn't really want to look at his proof too much, because the proof, remember, is all in your notebooks that you bring back that show all your calculations to work out where you've been, how fast you've gone across the ice, all this sort of stuff. And the doubt was cast on Peary because it just seemed like he was just covering too many miles in a day. It was as if the ice wasn't broken at all. He wasn't having to stop, that he was bang on target, all this kind of stuff. So what's interesting is that about 15, 20 years ago, National Geographic persuaded Wally Herbert, who was this great British ice explorer, Arctic and Antarctic explorer, they persuaded him to look at Peary's old notebooks. And they were hoping, I think, that Wally would look at them and say, right, that's it, Peary did get there. But actually, Wally looked at them and he came to exactly the opposite conclusion. He came to the conclusion that almost certainly Peary hadn't made it to the North Pole. He might have got within 30, 40 miles, but there's no conclusive proof that he actually made it. Now, at the same time, Wally had done a big traverse of the Arctic Ocean. He started in Barrow, and then he spent a winter, 1.5 years, crossing the Arctic. Now, he had resupplies on the way, but he definitely crossed over the North Pole and ended up in Svalbard, which, if you look at the maps, he basically tracked right across the North Pole. And that was the first time that anyone could conclusively prove that they had reached the North Pole over the top of the ice. There had been American submarines had surfaced at the North Pole before that. I think the USS Skate was the first one, around about 58, something like that. But Wally's trip in the 60s was the first to definitely go over it. But as I say, he did it with dogs. He had resupplies on the way. Planes would fly out and drop him support and things like that. And then the two Norwegians, Borge Ausland and Erlingskage, they did the sort of ultimate. They got to the North Pole and I think came back, presumably. Obviously, they got back, but they certainly...
Let's hope so.
Well, what I mean is, a lot of people will walk to the pole and then they will arrange for a twin otter to pick them up, to bring them back, because it's quite an epic getting to the North Pole. The timing is quite narrow. You have to leave quite early in the spring before the ice starts to break up. The temperatures are crippling, and of course, it's still significant bits of darkness, because you have to aim to get there before the ice is too broken up. But also, if you're going to get picked up by an aircraft, then the ice has to be good enough for the aircraft to land on. But anyway, Ausland and Kaga, they definitely got there, and I think Borge Ausland's gone on to do other things, like solo unsupported across the pole, that kind of thing. So the North Pole is still a big magnet for polar explorers, and it's certainly, well, put it this way, it's still tough, very tough. In fact, it's got tougher because of the change in the sea ice over the last 20, 25 years. The ice is breaking up a lot sooner. Even in the winter, it's more broken up than it used to be. And so the challenge of getting to the North Pole, across it, on the ice, on skis, or with a dog team, is much, much greater than it was. And to be honest, I'm not sure nowadays if Wally and his team and his dogs and things could actually... I'm not sure if you could do Wally's journey again now, because the ice would be just too thin and too broken up to be able to live on it for effectively 1.5 years.
And we'll come back to that idea of the ice breaking up shortly. I think you're right. I think Ausland did the unsupported solo expedition back in 1994. So not all that long ago, 26 years. You've gone across the land and you've gone under the North Pole. What was it like to be in a submarine?
It was weird. We went on a submarine to do a sequence of Peter Wadhams. Dr. Peter Wadhams has been travelling on these Royal Navy trips underneath the ice. They do them about every 2 years. And they were top secret at the time. There was a lot of interest in the North Pole when we had what we call the Cold War going on, which is when Russia and America were threatening to blow each other up. Basically, there's a lot of interest in the North Pole and the Arctic Ocean, because the shortest distance for one country to attack the other with missiles is not to fire your missiles across the Atlantic. It's basically launch them across the pole. And you could be especially interested if you found there was an area, say, near Russia, where the ice was consistently thinner through the winter than other parts. Then you could get your submarine right up close to the Arctic continent, pop up through the ice and lob missiles over. And likewise, the Russians were keen on finding out that. So there was a lot of classified movements of submarines underneath the Arctic Ocean through the 50s and into the 60s. And Peter went on these trips in the late 60s, early 70s, and managed to get a place on them. And he had special sonar, upward-facing sonar, that allowed him to measure the thickness of the ice as he moved underneath it. So we wanted to film a sequence of Peter. And I got to say, I mean, I didn't find living on a submarine particularly difficult. It's 45 metres long, 8 metres in diameter. But you've got to put 135 people into that tube, and you have to put it into 1/3 of the tube, because the front 2/3 of the tube is all nuclear reactor and engines, and nuclear power plant and things like that. And nobody goes in there except the engineers. So if you imagine, this tube pretty tight for 135 people. Basically, everybody shares a bunk, what's called hot bunking. So when you've finished your watch, your 8-hour watch, you get out of your bed and somebody else almost immediately gets into it. As far as space for personal equipment, you've got a drawer, which is maybe about, half a metre, less than that, 1/3 of a metre long, 1/3 of a metre wide. You've got to put all your clothes that you need into there. You're not allowed to take in any personal hygiene stuff. You can take your toothpaste, but you're not allowed to take any antiperspirants or stuff like that, because they screw around with the submarine's recirculating air supply. The main thing you come away with is just an incredible lack of space. And also, the longest corridor in the submarine was about 12 metres long. So your eyes become very accustomed to living short-sighted all the time. The only time that you might know you're moving would be if they were coming up or diving at a significant angle. Then you would feel that the floor or the deck underneath you would change angle slightly. But we never did fast enough turns to feel the G or anything like that. And we were actually we were sleeping underneath the cruise missiles. They all carry some cruise missiles, and they had these sort of fiberglass molded beds that they managed to bolt on underneath in the weapons preparation area, and we would sleep underneath a pretty narrow space. It was only about, well, if you sat up, suddenly you'd bang your head on a cruise missile, put it that way.
I can't imagine you saw much wildlife on that journey.
So, as I say, I wouldn't go to the North Pole, particularly for the animals.
So no candy canes and no reindeer?
I'm afraid not. Well, no, the reindeer are definitely not going to be. Although, Santa's magical reindeer, they can go wherever they want. But your normal reindeer, they're confined to the land. They might cross the sea ice, some of the frozen bays. In the winter, they might cross, 20-mile wide bay or something like that. But normally your reindeer are confined to the land, where they will be munching away on the lichens and stuff underneath the snow.
And it just so happens that we're joined with somebody who knows a little something about reindeer. Hi, Tilly.
Good morning. Good morning. And my name's Tilly Smith. I've been with the reindeer here in the Cairngorm Mountains since 1981. And I began as a volunteer, then as a zoology graduate. And today I've lived my dream, because I'm now co-owner of Britain's only free-ranging herd of reindeer.
And it was quite a romantic start to your journey into reindeer, is my understanding. I believe that it was your husband that took over the herd from the original owner, Michael Yutzi, in 1980. And as you said, you arrived in 1981, and it sounds as if it was love at first sight.
So yes, actually, so the story goes, it's true. This is from the horse's mouth. My husband Allan actually came to work for Mr. Utzi and Dr. Lindgren, who were the owners of the herd, back in 1978. and he was a school leaver, and he applied for the job as reindeer herder. I don't think he really knew what he was letting himself in for, but never mind. He came and started work as the herder, and during the first few months, Mr. Utsi passed away as an elderly man, and so Allan really kept looking after the herd for the family. I came along in 81 as a volunteer, and when I came up to Scotland from the south of England, I was absolutely astounded by the beauty of the Cairngorms. I mean, that view of the Northern Corries is astounding and stunning. The reindeer were particularly endearing. They're just such lovely animals to work with. And the keeper wasn't bad looking. So yes, 2 years later, we were married.
And you've both been running the reindeer company, I think, ever since.
Yes, so we then continued to work for the family, Dr. Lindgren and her son and stepson. And then when she passed away in 1988, the family didn't want to carry it on. It's fair dues. They had other fish to fry and lives to live, and they actually put the herd up for sale. And we were the only people stupid enough to buy them. Not at all. It was exactly what we wanted, and so since 1989, we have been the proud owners of this lovely herd.
And for those that maybe aren't sure, what does a reindeer company do?
Well, that's a good question. What does a reindeer company do? It sounds all very official. Actually, we go under the name of the Cairngorm Reindeer Centre. Sounds very grand. It's actually a room in a house with reindeer paddocks beside and 6,000 acres of hill ground that the herd lives on. And so our main income for the herd is by visitors coming and seeing reindeer in their natural environment. They are really a lovely example of an imaginative project that started back in 1952, where reindeer were reintroduced into their natural environment, and to this day people can come and enjoy seeing the reindeer there. So that's our main business, is reindeer living in their natural environment for people to come and enjoy.
Why is that natural environment so suited for reindeer?
Oh, I mean, the Cairngorm Mountains is the only high plateau area in Great Britain, and indeed in Scotland. It's much of the ground is above 4,000 feet. It has an Arctic and subarctic vegetation. It has a climate that is very similar to continental Europe, to Russia and Scandinavia. So in the wintertime, the Cairngorms tend to attract the snow, and in the summertime, we tend to get slightly drier conditions. The Cairngorms are also lovely sort of rolling mountains. They're not steep cliff edges, and that's absolutely perfect for reindeer who like to wander, have great big feet, and aren't agile like goats. They like a nice natural slope for them to graze on.
And what is it they're grazing on?
So at this time of year, we're moving into winter time. It's pretty chilly out there today, it has to be said. And one of their absolute most important food in the wintertime is lichen or lichen. You can pronounce it whichever way you like. And this grows on the ground up through the heather and up through the mosses, and the reindeer will dig down through the snow to get to it if necessary. They will also browse on the lichens or lichen that grows on rocks, and if they were in a woodland environment in the wintertime, they would certainly eat the lichens that grow on the trees as well. So that's very much their winter diet, and it's a sort of surviving feed. They can't grow on it, they can't get fat on it, but they can survive on it. What reindeer then do in the summertime is they feed on vegetation that's growing, that's young shoots of blaeberry and cowberry, and the deer sedges, the Arctic grasses, and this is what makes the reindeer grow in the summertime, put on weight, prepare for the winter time when they then have to survive on lichen.
And I guess that is actually quite similar to the pastures that you might find in Lapland.
Absolutely. And when Mr. Utsi came here in the end of the 1940s, he was actually on honeymoon with his new wife, Dr. Lindgren. And I think they were on a bit of a mission to see whether they could bring some of his reindeer from northern Sweden. And he came to the Cairngorms. He went to many places in the Highlands, and he was struck by the massive similarity between the two and the presence of lichen. And so it was on that notion that they brought reindeer back to Scotland in 1952.
And lichen itself is quite an interesting organism. It's not actually a single organism at all. It's actually a really good example of a stable symbiotic association between a fungus and an algae, or possibly a cyanobacteria. And it's something that some of our young people might have discussed when they've learned about symbiosis within the higher course. But obviously for the reindeer, that's really is their main food source.
Yeah, it is a really interesting plant. There's many, many thousands of species of lichen as well, right across the world. And reindeer, without a doubt, evolved alongside this niche of lichen, which is available to them in the wintertime. And because of its symbiosis, it can still grow under the snow when there's no light, but when there is light, it can grow by photosynthesis. So it's a fascinating relationship between reindeer and lichen or lichen across the world.
And how many reindeer do you have this now, Tilly?
So we keep the herd at about 150. That's split actually between two sites now. We established a second site some 20 years ago to take a bit of pressure off the grazing on the cairngorms, make the reindeer more manageable for us. And within that herd of 150, there's obviously breeding males, there's breeding females, there's young reindeer born in the spring, immature reindeer growing up to become breeding animals, and of course our castrated males, what we call our Christmas reindeer, who help us at Christmas time and pull sleighs and help to generate a further income for the herd.
And out of all of those reindeer, how many do have red noses?
Right, so red nose only comes on Christmas Eve. On a very foggy night. I believe the name of that reindeer is Rudolph. But it's an interesting topic, that, because there has been some scientific research done on the actual noses of reindeer. They have completely furry noses, interestingly, and this means that they don't get if you had a wet nose like a cow, this would of course get frosted up in the wintertime in the very, very cold conditions that they experience, or indeed when they're pushing their noses down through the snow. But they have also found that there's more capillaries in the tips of the noses of reindeer, which means that, yes, in theory, reindeer have a slightly reddened nose.
And I guess that will help keep it warm when it's flying through the air, pulling a sled.
Absolutely, keep it warm, flying through the air, the fur on the nose as well. But most importantly, it means that they don't get a frozen nose. And they're quite interesting reindeer because they just look bog standard. I mean, when you look at them, you think, well, it doesn't look like a polar bear. I can imagine a polar bear living on the ice floe. But reindeer are highly adapted to cold conditions, and indeed, they live in some of the coldest parts of the world in central Russia. Their coats are massively dense, their winter coats. It's two-layered, and each head is hollow. Air is a very, very good insulator. So it's just like an enormous duvet wrapped around these reindeer in the wintertime. They're so well insulated, they don't melt the snow they lie on. And so they let the heat out and they don't let the cold in. They also have a much lower metabolic rate in the wintertime. So they're not looking to eat all the time. They're not needing food. They can lie around. They're not hibernating, but they're just ticking over at a really low rate. So again, not needing energy, not conserving their energy. They have massive feet, reindeer, really big flat feet, almost like clowns, really. And these feet are for the snow. They're for walking on the snow so they don't sink through it as they walk along. And they also use them as fantastic shovels so they can dig through the snow to get to the food underneath. And I've been in northern Sweden in February when the snow is about 3 feet deep, and all you see is the bottoms of reindeer. They are digging down through that snow to get to the lichen. It's a tough existence for a reindeer.
And I guess it's even tougher around this time of year. For them as things start to ramp up for Christmas. Do you see any difference in their behaviour over Christmas?
Yeah, they escaped that. No. So the reindeer, the Christmas time is a fun time for us. It's a lovely time to be able to show off our beautiful reindeer. And we do have a number of reindeer that are specifically trained for Christmas time to do that sort of work. And this training starts when they're just calves at 6 months old, and we'll get them used to being on a halter, just like you train a pony. And then you put a little bit of soft harness on them. Then they really don't do anything apart from potter along at the back of a sleigh until they become fully grown Christmas reindeer at 3 years old. And at that point, we would train them to pull a sleigh, to be at the front, pulling the sleigh with another reindeer that's done it all before. So it's all just reinforced learning. And we're leading them. We don't drive them like a pony. And we do little bits of this work at Christmas time through November and December. Indeed, I've come to Glasgow many times in the past and further afield. We do work at home. We do work away from home within UK mainland. Of course, this year has been very different because all of our events have been cancelled due to the pandemic. So the reindeer have been furloughed. They've got nothing to do this year.
Have any of them got to a level that they've ever been called up by Santa at the last minute?
Okay, so that's Santa's prerogative. I mean, I bring my reindeer up into tip-top condition. They're looking great. They've got lovely antlers. They're ready to go. And if Santa feels that some of our Cairngorm reindeer need to be used to pull that sleigh, then he comes and picks them on Christmas Eve. But by the time I get up on Christmas Day, they're back. They're back on the hillside.
Have you ever had a reindeer pull a sledge for you, Doug?
No, I've always just had the only animal I've ever had pull a sledge is the huskies, the husky dogs, or a snow machine. But they do use. I mean, if you go to the north of up into Lapland, north of Finland, north of Norway, then there are reindeer herders up there who live with their herds of reindeer all year round, and they use them to pull their sledges around and all the rest of it. It's a very traditional sort of way to live. They use snow machines. They're one of these people in the Arctic who've got 1 foot in the present and very definitely 1 foot in the past. And that's where you would go to see reindeer getting used every day for a very practical purpose for them to work with them and tow their sledges around. And no, I've never been towed by reindeer, but it could be useful. They might be more controllable. The worst thing with huskies is that they quite often, even when the guy on the sledge knows how to drive them, they sometimes have a mind of their own, and they're liable to take you charging over, really rough, lumpy ice and everything, get battered around and all the rest of it, and you've really got to hang on for grim life. So maybe you wouldn't get that problem with reindeer if they were pulling you.
Before we got sidetracked with reindeer, you started to mention breaking the ice up in the Arctic, and obviously the Arctic somewhere you've been going for a long time, Doug, and you've seen the kind of impact of climate change firsthand. How worried are you?
Well, climate change. I first went to the Arctic in 1988, and it was sort of at the end of what I'd call the stable season, stable timing. You went out with the Inuit, and they could tell you, how and when the ice would break up within their immediate locale. And that gave them immense confidence to be able to work out on the sea ice, away from land, or to work out on these big long bays that you get out there, knowing that you would be safe, say until 10th of June, for example, the 15th of June. They would say, no, fine, we can stay here because the cracks don't develop behind us until around about the 10th, 12th of June. And it gave us great confidence and that we could do a lot of stuff. And they knew when the animals would turn up and all that sort of stuff. But all that predictability has decreased considerably in the last 25 years. The ice is breaking up sooner. The Inuit are less sure of themselves. And it's generally made filming, harder, generally. And they know, for example, they're also very in tune with when the berries, for example, form on the bushes. The berries used to be, and still is to some extent, an important source of food for them in the late summer. And the women would go out collecting the berries. Well, the berries are forming much sooner than they used to be. And so lots of things are happening. Another film that I made early on was we went to film the bowhead whale hunting in Alaska. Every year the Inuit in Alaska are allowed to hunt. That time it was about 5 bowhead whales. And with Barrow, they used to go out and camp on the edge of the sea ice, where the sea ice meets the open ocean. They would go and they would camp out there and wait for the whales to come past, and then they would go out and hunt some. Which, I mean, 5 bears is really a very, very small amount compared to the population that was passing was something like 8,000 bowheads would be passing in front. So taking 4 or 5 was fine, very sustainable. But I don't think they can do that anymore, because that ice edge that they used to rely on going out and camping on at the time of year when the bowheads were coming past, that sea ice is just not stable enough to go out there and wait for the bowheads to come. So there's no doubt that everywhere you go in the Arctic, it seems like things are changing. And if you talk to the Inuit, they will tell you how much things are changing. And the ice is getting thinner there. As I say, the temperatures can be all over the place. I don't know what it is just now, but as I say, the fact is that a lot of the Arctic was swept by plus 10 degrees centigrade in the middle of December, in the middle end of December a few years ago, and that's way, way higher than they ever used to get. So climate change in the Arctic is definitely one of these places where it's very visible. It's happening very, very quickly. And of course, what happens in the Arctic impinges on so much else of the weather, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere. And I think, the climate scientists and the meteorologists have been linking this rapidly changing Arctic with rapidly changing elements of the weather in other parts of the world. I remember reading that the changing Arctic could be directly linked to the drought and the dust storms and things that they're having in certain parts of China. You could kind of see the change and follow it. But the weather systems of the world are immensely complicated, and every year we're finding out different elements that we can measure, and they all interact together in such a complicated way that it is hard to be completely accurate. But on the other hand, as I say, if you look at the trends, we have if you think of the sea ice as having a volume, okay, not just an area, you could talk about the sea ice almost covering the Arctic Ocean in the winter and then receding in the summer, and you end up with smaller ice area covering it. But remember, that ice also has a thickness. So if we measure the thickness of the ice, either by submarines going underneath it, or now we can do it with satellites. If we measure the thickness of that sea ice and then look at the area, you can end up with the volume of the sea ice. And when you plot that volume over the last 20 years, the volume is dropping every year. So not only is there less sea ice in the summer in terms of area, but the thickness is much less in the winter. So that becomes what we call positive feedback, Paul. If you have thinner ice in the winter, that means it's more likely to break up earlier in the summer. If it breaks up earlier in the summer, then there is more black water, and that black water absorbs the heat, so the little bit of ice left will melt a bit more. That warmer sea in the summer will be slower to freeze in the autumn, which makes the ice thinner again in the winter. So it freezes, so it breaks up even earlier. So you're into this seasonal cycle where things they're just gradually getting worse. And there are some people who predict that, within the next 3 or 4 years, somebody will take a yacht to the North Pole. You won't need a 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 horsepower icebreaker to get there. If you choose your time, you'll be able to zigzag between the flows with your yacht.
And of course, the last time you were on the podcast, Doug, you talked about working with Sir David Attenborough and what he was like as a person. Well, over the past couple of months, I've actually read his latest book, A Life on Our Planet, which I guess is basically his witness statement of what he's observed during his own life. And towards the end of the book, he actually talks about what's kind of expected in the years ahead, including that in the 2030s, the Arctic Ocean's obviously expected to have its first entirely ice-free summer, resulting in open water at the North Pole, which, as you say, would allow somebody to just sail up there. That the kind of knock-on effect of that is far beyond obviously just access to the North Pole, but it would mean the algal forests underneath the ice would be kind of cast off into the sea, and that would then obviously have a knock-on effect in the whole Arctic food chain. Well, have you seen those kind of algal forests under the ice, and what is it like under there? And
yeah, the algal forest, so to speak. Yes, there's a classic. In the winter in the Arctic, it's too dark really for plants to grow, either in the water column, either in the water itself, or underneath the ice. But come the spring, and especially come the melt, when the snow melts on top of the ice becomes much more transparent, and much more light will come down through the ice and will illuminate the water underneath, but also there's more light underneath the ice. And there are the little microalgae that grow in the ice through the winter, and they start to multiply. They really start to rev up, and you get this green scum developing underneath the ice. And in some species of algae, those green scum become like long flowing tendrils, which is probably the closest thing to look for. If you go and look in a river, you'll sometimes see long, wavy bits of weed growing in the river, just rippling in the current. Well, imagine that growing underneath the ice. That's the kind of thing. And I've filmed, these long strands of ice, and then long strands of algae. And some of the long strands, of course, will get broken up in the current, and they will go into the water, and they will seed, so to speak. They will also then carry on reproducing in the water. So it's amazing when you film in the Arctic underneath the ice in certain places at the end of May into June. You get wonderful clear visibility. You get visibility of 50 meters underneath the ice. But by 3 weeks later, with the 24-hour daylight, with the growth of this algae underneath the ice, the visibility is like pea soup. It just absolutely explodes. This polar explosion, this polar pulse of life is a very well-known feature of the Arctic. And it grows especially fast too, because under the winter, in the winter, there has been so little growing underneath the ice that the nutrients, so to speak, have just gathered and accumulated in the water column. And suddenly, with the return of the sea and a few little algae growing there, suddenly there is nothing limiting the growth. It's got plenty of food, it's got plenty of sunlight, and it just goes mad. And within a month, it goes from crystal clear and no algae in it at all to so much algae that you can barely see 2 meters through it. And then given time, that algae will exhaust all the food, it will drop off, and it starts to get clear again. But yes, there's no doubt that down underneath the ice, it's like everything's upside down. There's lots of stuff growing on the bottom of the sea ice, and these long tendrils of ice floating around, and it just looks the same as if you're diving in a river, but the tendrils of algae and weediness and stuff are growing from the bottom.
And of course, when you take those algal forests away, you're taking away a really crucial part of the food webs under there, which has a knock-on effect the whole way through those food webs for other bigger organisms.
Well, plants are at the basis of the food chain. Every animal on the planet, pardon me, algae are right at the bottom of the food chain. I think there's no animal in the world. The basic animal, like a cow, starts as a herbivore. In other words, so it eats the grass, and the grass has this way of converting sunlight into energy, which animals don't have. If we took away all plants, then there would be no animals. It's quite simple. So these algal forests, or the algal bloom in the summer, that is at the basis of the food chain for all the other stuff that animals live on, all the fish. If your algae gets fed upon by little things like copepods, the copepods get fed on by very small fish. The fish get eaten by bigger fish. The fish get eaten by seals. The seals get eaten by polar bear. So in a way, you could say that the polar bear is as dependent on the algal bloom of the Arctic as is all the other animals.
Over the years, you've spent some time with Sir David and others in these remote and magical places, Doug. I can imagine you've had some pretty deep conversations in the evenings on these expeditions.
David is a great person to be with, because he's so much. There's nothing high and mighty about him. He listens to other people as much as they want to listen to him. He has a remarkable range of remarkable memory for a range of stories. And he will talk about, I don't know if it happened to him, I think it was happened to Mike Potts, but Mike was working on a series for David, and basically this polar bear came along and stuck its head through the window of the cabin that Mike was living in, and Mike picked up this frying pan and whacked it on the nose and it ran away. And David likes to tell stories like that, but it's also easy to forget that, he's been doing this for a long time, and he's been in some hairy situations himself. The one that I like hearing about is how way back, I think it was for either Life on Earth or Living Planet, which was two of his first two big series, they wanted to film on an island round about the Galapagos Islands. There was something special they wanted to go to. But you have to remember that back in those days, there was no GPS. They had to go out with a local fisherman who knew where to go, because these maps, these islands weren't on the maps. And basically, they went out for 2 weeks and they couldn't find this island. They came back with nothing. So David likes to tell that one compared to how things are now. When you go out, and David would basically disappear for 6 weeks, more or less off the face of the planet, him and a camera person and maybe a sound man. And they would come back after 6 weeks, 8 weeks with a film. And he laughs to himself when he talks about doing that compared to the number of people that go on a shoot today, and also the amount of connectivity you have today compared to back in those days. I think even David looks back sometimes wistfully at how much of the planet was virgin, and what a great chance he had to explore it, 50, 60 years ago compared to now.
Going back to obviously the kind of ice caps, on a very basic level, I guess losing those ice caps would mean the Earth's going to be less white just to look at, and that obviously means that it will be reflecting less light from the sun, which will speed up global warming even more. And we obviously talked about the kind of predictions for 2030s. The predictions for 2040s suggest that a quarter of the northern hemisphere could basically be a bloodbath, and that's 20 years away. It doesn't really feel very Christmassy anymore thinking about that.
No, it really is. It's scary. I think there's a greater awareness now of climate change and the way things are changing and the threat, the real changes that we're faced with. I think there's a greater awareness of that than I can remember for a long time. We were pretty environmentally conscious in the late 60s, early 70s. And then somehow we lost it. Somehow we got distracted by listening too much to people who wanted us to buy stuff and wanted global trade and all this sort of stuff. And now suddenly we've realised that we do have a planet which it's not sustainable to keep living the way that we are. People have known that for quite a long time. And if we decided to make changes 30 years ago, then they could have been more gradual. We could be living in a very different way now. But there's no doubt that we're going to have to be living in a very different way in 15 to 20 years. And it's good to see that we've got, renewable energies top of the pile. People are talking about electric cars, all the rest of it. But we also need to be talking about a wholly different economy. We need to be working to an economy whereby genuinely stuff is reused, recycled. We need to move away from having to have new stuff created, and that makes its own problems. But it's really good that the COP26, which is the next big meeting of all the people, it's really good that that's in Glasgow. It's really desperate that it had to get cancelled from last year, because literally every year counts. And to give you some idea of how fast things are moving, everybody was patting themselves on the back, weren't they, in 2015 with the Paris Agreement. But now within 5 years, we're realising that those targets, first of all, they haven't been made concrete enough, but secondly, that many of them are not strong enough. We're going to have to aim even higher than we thought we'd have to aim 5 years ago. And we've seen some things with COVID. We've seen the great thing has been how much money can appear out of nowhere when the threat is great enough. Climate change is a harder one. It's a really tough one to sell, because the threat undoubtedly is there, but it's just slower moving and it's going to come in a different way. But if we can carry away some of the momentum, some of the imagination, some of the opening up of funds, if we can see that going into green things, then and really push for, COP26 should be a real turning point. And I think Scotland is well placed to do, to set a proper example for it, because there's lots of environmental issues where Scotland is certainly leading the UK in terms of recycling, and there's also great potential. In terms of renewables, Scotland possibly has more renewable potential than possibly even England. So it would be, I really hope that COP26 is, I'm sure it will be a massive success, but I hope it's a success in the sense of getting things done rather than just more talking.
I'm a great believer that it is through people like Sir David Attenborough and yourself, Doug, and the kind of travels that you've done and bringing those to television screens and film theatres across the country and opening up access to these magical places and the biodiversity that are in these places, that people become far more aware of the planet that we live on and the threat that those places face. Through those travels, have you come across Santa Claus?
I did. The closest I got was actually when I went to an Inuit community up in the Arctic, and they told me he had been there the week before. It was kind of on his holidays. It was at the tail end of summer, October, and he was talking about how much he had to do between then and Christmas. But like I say, he just passed through about a week before I got there, so unfortunately I had to miss out on the chance to meet him.
Maybe next time. And thankfully, for those that are worried about Santa losing his home through climate change, he may not actually be impacted the way some might expect. The real Santa Claus, or at least the historical figure upon which the legend's based, never actually lived anywhere near the North Pole. I think St Nicholas of Myra was a 4th century bishop who actually lived in the place that we would now refer to as Turkey.
You're spoiling it for me. I don't want to know he lived in Turkey. I don't think he lived in Turkey. Maybe at the top of some snowy mountain, perhaps, in Turkey.
That was the country, obviously, not the bird that many of us will tuck into on Christmas Day. What's your own favourite part of Christmas dinner, Doug?
Oh, it's just nice. Well, it's going to be difficult this year. It's just nice to get around the table and have a good chat to folk. And probably my favourite bit, to be honest, is probably right at the end when somebody gets out a bottle of whiskey and we all have a quick snifter.
In moderation, and if you're over 18,
of course. In moderation, of course.
And are you hoping for anything in particular from Santa this year?
Oh, no, I don't think so. I'm lucky I've pretty much got most of what I need, thank you. So I'm not expecting anything from him. There may be some things come from up north, but it's going to be a much quieter Christmas than usual. But I don't mind that. I think, to be honest, if the weather is as mild or not as cold, but as calm as it looks like it might be being, I might treat myself to a decent cycle run on Christmas Day and take myself down to the coast and whiz around there for a wee while.
Very nice. Have you got your Christmas tree up yet?
No, the Christmas tree isn't up yet. I'm just back from Italy. So the Christmas tree will go up probably tomorrow, something like that.
Any a real Christmas tree or an artificial one, Doug?
It'll be an artificial one. I think I've had it for a few years. I've even got a wee Christmas bauble, 2 Christmas baubles, one in the shape of a walrus and one as a narwhal. Would you believe somebody sent me a narwhal Christmas tree decoration a few years ago? So that goes up, but no, it'll go up on an artificial tree because, as I say, I think overall, I've had it so many years that it's certainly greener, let's say, having that than it is to have a real one.
And somebody that can tell us a little bit more about Christmas trees is Rory Young from the British Christmas Tree Growers Association.
Good morning, Paul.
So we've just heard from Doug Allan, who's still to put his Christmas tree up. He's leaving it a wee bit late. He's got an artificial tree and he's telling us it's more green. What do you make of that?
Bah humbug. I have a huge amount of respect for Doug Allan and have enjoyed watching many of his programmes that he's been involved in making over the years, but I think it's probably one of the misconceptions that the industry has to face on a fairly regular basis, that artificial trees are a more sustainable way to celebrate Christmas. But There has been an amount of research being put into this, mainly in North America and Canada. And generally speaking, the information that we receive anyway is that unless you use an artificial tree for more than 9 years, it's less sustainable than actually celebrating Christmas with a real tree. So the big challenge with an artificial tree is not only using it for long enough to offset the carbon that's gone into not only making it, because it's effectively it's a fossil fuel-based product, it's made out of oil, and inevitably they're made in the Far East, so they're then shipped all the way around the world to you and I. But one of the main challenges is actually getting rid of them. So they can't be recycled. We're not aware of any way of being able to recycle an artificial tree because of the way it's made and because of the way the products are all intertwined. So they effectively end up in landfill and they don't break down. So they're there forever. The advantages we have as an industry, we believe, is many sort of multifaceted, if you like, because not only do we provide work in this country, so there's around about, as a ballpark figure, we think about 4 to 5 million trees every year produced in the UK and sold in the UK, and they create quite a lot of work. So there's a social and financial impact there for local communities. A lot of the Christmas trees, or a significant proportion of the Christmas trees, are grown in Scotland. There are some grown in England, but certainly the largest proportion are grown in Scotland, and they tend to be grown in rural areas, so that the employment that they provide is quite important for what would otherwise be quite challenging areas to find work, if you like. So that's an important part that I think a lot of people forget about. And there's also the benefit that the plantations provide to wildlife. So you can have a look on our website, Scottish Christmas Trees, and you'll see a lot of pictures there. We have, birds, we have insects, butterflies, a lot of spiders, birds of prey. We have a huge number of animals that live in and around our plantations. So they do provide an environment there throughout the cycle of the tree, which incidentally, the rotation of our trees is 10 years. So from when we plant our tree to when they're actually harvested is around about 10 years. So it's a long-term project. The other thing I think that people perhaps are becoming more aware of is that trees, as they're growing, absorb CO2, and the byproduct of that is that they emit oxygen. So to put that into context, 1 acre of Christmas trees, which is roughly speaking about 2,500 Christmas trees, produces enough oxygen for 18 people. So on our farm here, we have, I'm not very good at maths, 250 acres of Christmas trees. So whatever 250 times 18 is, we produce a lot of oxygen. So there's a lot of benefits there throughout the life cycle of the product. But as I said earlier, one of the main challenges with artificial trees is getting rid of them. And having a real tree, there are a lot of alternative options to get rid of your tree at the end of the season. There are some people who sell trees who will take them back and they will mulch them and either put them back into the ground where the trees are grown, or they use them in kids' play areas as a bottoming. A lot of councils now provide recycling services as well. So there's a lot of options to get rid of your tree at the end of its useful period.
And lots of people put their Christmas trees up a wee bit earlier this year to try and bring a bit of Christmas spirit to everybody after what's been quite a long year. The downside for that, for people with real Christmas trees, is of course trying to keep them going into the new year. What advice do you have for people whose Christmas trees maybe starting to look a wee bit sorry for itself?
Paul, it's a bit of a challenge for us as an industry. We are seeing this creep, and it's not just this year, although this year has taken a fairly significant leap forward. Each year, people are looking to put their trees up earlier and earlier and earlier, and we're now seeing a higher proportion of trees actually being sold to the end user in November than we've ever seen before. And this year, to be honest, we've seen a staggering leap forward. But I think you've hit the nail on the head. People are fed up. They've had a challenging year. As they want to bring a bit of festive spirit into their home, and putting a tree up is a great way to do that. So it is a challenge. At the end of the day, a cut Christmas tree is just like a cut flower. And getting it to last in someone's house for the period they're now asking is a challenge. But the best thing to do is treat it like a cut flower. So when you bring it into your home, if you can, cut an inch off the bottom and put it into anything that holds water. the key is to not let your tree dehydrate. So the reason that they shed needles is because the trees become dehydrated. So just like you would when you buy your mum some flowers to thank her for all the hard work she does, you cut an inch off the bottom of those, cut an inch off the bottom of the tree, put it in a pot and water it. And a 6-foot tree will use probably between 1 and 2 litres of water every day for about the first 5 days until it becomes used to the warm environment you've put it into. And then the water consumption will drop right off to next to nothing. So if you can keep it hydrated, as long as you don't put it beside a fire or a radiator, they should last comfortably. If you've bought a fresh tree from a local producer, they should last comfortably for 3 to 4 weeks. But yeah, we are seeing more people expecting the product to last for nearer to 6 weeks. And that is, if I'm being honest, a challenge.
And what time of year do you start cutting trees then, Rory? Obviously, you say people want to get them a wee bit earlier, and that seems to be a bit of a trend. But when do you guys have to start sort of ramping up to get ready for that?
Well, we have 5 full-time staff all year round, but we take on seasonal staff, which usually starts in early October, and this involves labelling the trees and making sure we know exactly where all the trees are that are for sale. But actually cutting the trees doesn't tend to start till about the 10th of November. It takes us about a week from the point at which we cut the tree to actually having it with our customer, and we'll have some customers that will want trees in store usually by about the 3rd week in November. So we usually start around about the 10th.
Thanks very much for coming on and having a chat with us, and hopefully have a Merry Christmas and we can look forward to some decent trees next year.
You're welcome, Paul. Enjoy your break. I'm sure you and your pupils all deserve it.
So before we finish, we've got Mr. Quant from Knightswood Secondary School in Glasgow, who is currently battling it out with Robbie Williams and Ariana Grande for the Christmas #1. Mr. Quant, what's going on?
So we just came out with a Christmas song. Me and another teacher from High School of Glasgow, Mr. Ford, made a Christmas tune. Put it out on Facebook, not really expecting much, and it got thousands and thousands of views in the first hours. And then, radio stations started picking up on it. We got comments from all over the world. It's just gone a bit crazy. So, yeah.
And obviously, the Higher Biology podcast isn't the only interview you've been doing this morning or this week. You've been on Radio 2 and BBC Scotland, and
yeah, I don't know what else is coming up with it. We've been on STV, on Radio 2, on BBC Scotland. I think there's a few more interviews this week on some radio stations, but we'll see. See how far it goes.
And then in between interviews, taking physics lessons. Yeah, it doesn't really get much better than that.
No, it's the best of both worlds. Living the pop star life whilst being able to teach physics as well.
So, what's the song about?
Yeah, so I kind of came to my friend Mr. Ford, and I was just telling him, wouldn't it be great to write a Christmas song? Because we've written a few songs together, kind of more folky stuff. And he thought, yeah, it was a good idea. So he wrote some lyrics down, sent it to me on text message. I looked at them, made the music and a tune to it, and then before long we had a song. Really, it's not your kind of normal Christmas song, because obviously Christmas is a bit different this year, and we wanted to make something that kind of acknowledge the fact that it's been a really hard year for a lot of people, and a lot of people are going to be missing their families at Christmas and missing everyone that they loved. And so we sort of wanted to make a song that acknowledged that, but also gave people really hope that it's not going to always be like this and that it will get better. So over the period just of about 3 weeks, I managed to record it in a wee bedroom in my house where I've got a little studio set up, and put it out on the 1st of December.
And currently, obviously, you're sitting above Robbie Williams in the charts. Ambitions to go a wee bit higher before Christmas, do you think?
Yeah, we'll see how far it'll get. I don't know if we've peaked or whether we've got more to go, but just things come out of the blue and all of a sudden you're shooting up the charts again. So we're tentatively hoping that we can chart and maybe get into the top 10 before Christmas, but we'll see.
Thanks to Doug, Tilly, Rory and Mr. Quant for joining me. The podcast will be back after Christmas with our next episode on the evolution key area of the Higher Biology course. But for now, we'll leave you with Mr. Quant. This is Lapwing and their Christmas single, Hope Christmas Gets You to Me.
A sparkle of light in the dark of the year, like hope taking hold of your hand. It's a time full of laughter and love without fear. The this year I now understand. 'Cause I'm missing the touch of the ones that I love. Couldn't care less what's under the tree. I don't know what I'm getting for Christmas this year, but I'm hoping it gets you to me. Outside it is snowing, the fire is glowing, old films repeat on TV. This I know only, without you I'm lonely. Are you out there and thinking of me? 'Cause I'm missing the touch of the ones that I love. Couldn't care less what's under the tree. I don't know what I'm getting for Christmas this year, but I'm hoping it gets you to me. What are you asking for Christmas this year? What is it asking of you? If it's true in the giving that life is worth living, then I'm sending my heart out to you. A sparkle of light in the dark of the year, I go taking hold of your hand. It's the promise of laughter and love without fear, the returning of joy to the land. I can't wait for the touch of the ones that I love. Couldn't care less what's under the tree. I don't know what I'm getting for Christmas this year, but I'm hoping it gets you to me. It gets you to me.